Hi everyone, we're on to Lecture 5 today, which will cover Pennebaker and Smythe's first two chapters. I'd suggest, if you haven't already done so, to begin your free writing journal now, today, because you'll need quite a few entries. I'd suggest at least like two a day to do well on this reflective essay at the end of the semester. And we'll end the PowerPoint presentation today with a free writing exercise that can get you started if you haven't already done so. As a reminder, tomorrow night by 10 p.m., that's July 2nd, your second quiz is due, and again, you'll do that on Canvas. Okay, on to Pennebaker and Smythe's first two chapters. So, in this first chapter, the authors are really just asking two questions. First question is there some kind of universal urge among humans to confess? And their answer, as you can see when you read, is typically yes. Second question is it healthy to do so? So you have this kind of universal tendency to confess. Well, is it good for you or not? And their answer again is, well, typically yes. A few words to mention here. Number one, I think their use of confess in this sense is really loaded. Pennebaker used that term confession in his earliest book on this topic, which the current book is an outgrowth of. And but you'll notice through the text he gets away from this kind of confession language, which is kind of religiously loaded at times, but also oftentimes implies a kind of wrongdoing, right? That you need to confess something. And so I really prefer the kind of more neutral language of disclosure, which is really what the research literature uses. Okay, so yeah, they seem to think that there's a kind of the part of being human involves a kind of interest in disclosing, and typically those things that are closest to you or most meaningful to you. And they give one example. It's not very, evidence based, right? This opening chapter is a bit anecdotal at this point, but the authors mention Pennebaker's sort of anecdotal conclusion or anecdotal experiment in his classroom when he broke the class into two different groups and had them kind of introduce themselves. And his conclusion was sort of counterintuitively that in their small groups, the people who talked the most got the most out of the group and claimed to have learned the most out of the group interactions, rather than the folks who were actually just listening. And so that's sort of one little nod toward this notion of the value of disclosure. Secondly, right, is it healthy to do so? And that's really, that's the theme of the book. That's the through line of this entire book, and as far as I can tell, is, it's an inquiry, it's an exploration of Pennebaker's early research on this question. And typically, is it healthy to disclose? He's focusing on mostly writing, though there are a few studies that you'll read that refer to, verbal disclosure, talking with people. And so, as you're reading the book, I would suggest keeping track of when the authors are talking about written disclosure versus verbal disclosure. In your book review, you wouldn't want to confuse those two. So anyhow, under this issue of is it healthy to disclose, typically written in written form, the authors answer yes. And one anecdotal piece of evidence they include from Pennebaker's earlier book is the polygraph confession effect, right? And that was simply the case where, in the case of the vice president of the bank, which they then generalize, probably in an unscientific way, to people in general, they claim that they generalize that people typically can show a reduction in stress after admitting to a crime, which they're framing as a disclosure or a confession, even though it could be a serious crime. In the case of the vice president of the bank, he was looking at long-term, some sort of jail sentence probably, and yet his physiological responses were higher before he confessed than after he confessed. And so they conclude from this, as well as a bunch of other work that happens off stage in this, outside the scope of this book, they conclude that, basically that keeping secrets is stressful, and that stress can psychosomatically affect the body and mind. You can read countless examples where they discuss that in the chapter. And that disclosure, whether in speech or in writing, can therefore decrease that stress, decrease the effect of keeping secrets, because keeping secrets is a form of inhibition. You're trying to inhibit yourself, your mind, from going to a certain place, from sharing, from discussing, and that causes stress. So disclosing reduces that stress and therefore can show improvements in physical and mental correlates of well-being. So this becomes known as the inhibition theory of free writing. Later in the text you'll see researchers are trying to understand why it works. And I think Pennebaker and Smythe's approach is probably the most mainstream of those answers. And that is simply that, it's right, is that inhibiting one's thoughts it requires work, bodily and mental work. And that work is stressful, and therefore a great deal of that stress, takes its toll on us in various ways. Now, this last bullet I want to mention, it's not discussed in the text, but I think it's really important. The book you're reading is the third version of this text. This revised version, I think, left out some important information. The primary point being, I hope you don't take from this chapter that the authors are trying to remove each of our boundaries to privacy, our boundaries from others, right? We all still have clearly a right to privacy in our lives, and not sharing anything we don't wish to with others, unless we choose to. And so I don't want you to think some of their language in this chapter is a bit cavalier. That secrets hurt us, and that we have a universal need to share. Well, it's a popular book, and they're trying to make general claims in this opening chapter. The research would never use this sort of language if you read the actual clinical research on the matter. And so I just want to kind of safeguard the notion that they're not, they wouldn't want us to think that they are advocating sort of the removal of healthy boundaries among people, right? And that we do have a right to keep whatever secrets we want under the label of, honoring our privacy. Okay, so that's kind of the opening to chapter 1 that I'd share. Of course, there's a lot more going on. I thought I would hit some of the high points. On to chapter 2. Again, there's more going on in this chapter than I'll discuss, but I want to simply explain the first 2 studies. And so just to give us a way of talking about these studies, make sure you understand how clinical research works conceptually, and then you can continue to read the chapter with these in mind. So this Pennebaker and Beale study in 1986, that was the first study in the scientific tradition of free writing in the English-speaking world, and so it was a big deal. Beale was Pennebaker's grad student at the time, and so you can see here that they refer to free writing as expressive writing. That's the typical psychology term for free writing. In the humanities, it's oftentimes known as free writing, and I'll use expressive writing and free writing interchangeably in this course. So what did they do? I think Pennebaker and Beale at this point were still at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Pennebaker had yet to become chair of UT Austin's psych program. So what did they do? They're probably at SMU. They get together 46 college students, break them into 2 groups. Both groups free wrote for 15 minutes a day, and I'll get into what free writing is later. They free wrote 15 minutes a day for 4 consecutive days. Okay, so that's, not a lot of writing, and only for 4 days. Now, the 2 groups were the control group and the experimental group, and that's how psychological research of this nature works. In the control group, they put half the college students, randomly assigning them to that group, and those folks just wrote about a superficial topic. In this study, it was about, I think, what was, to describe their shoes or describe their dorm room, something like that. So the idea is that it's a superficial topic that shouldn't have much of an effect on their well being. The experimental group then had a different topic, and those 23 students were asked to write about their thoughts and feelings about the most upsetting or even traumatic experience in their lives. Now, the book, if you read the footnote at this point in the book, you'll see there's a bit of a discrepancy. The actual study was more complicated. It had some folks writing just about their thoughts, and others writing about their thoughts and feelings, and then others writing in the control group. And what turned out was that the folks who wrote about their thoughts and feelings had the biggest beneficial effect from the free writing. And so in the Pennebaker and Smythe book, in the body, they actually leave out that third group of the people who just wrote about their thoughts because it's not that important, right? That group was never followed up with later because we realized at that point, it's the thoughts and feelings group that has the benefit. So there's a bit of glossing over in the body there of the real study. If you want to read the real study, email me. I can send you the Pennebaker and Beal 1986 study itself. Okay, so back to the book. So those folks who wrote about their thoughts and feelings about an upsetting or traumatic experience in their lives for these 15 minutes a day for 4 consecutive days, they showed experimental results, meaning right like um, you know, measurable results in a scientific setting. And the first is they showed that they immediately felt worse after finishing their free writing each day. And so, mood wise, right, they had an increase in sadness and in anxiety, but that over time, they really started to value that writing experience, and it helped them make meaning out of what they were anxious about or sad about, right, about the experience they wrote about. And so there's a kind of curve here, right, that immediately after the free writing, at least when you're writing about very upsetting or traumatic experiences, you don't feel immediate. According to Pennebaker and Beal, their participants didn't feel immediately better, but days later, in the weeks that followed, they did feel better. Um, and the other benefit of the free writing on the experimental group was that those folks who wrote in the experimental group had fewer health center visits for illness in the next 6 months. So this was a pretty landmark finding that you got to remember. This was back in the 80s. Psychosomatic medicine was new, so people were still questioning the link between mind and body. And Pennebaker and Smythe discussed this to some degree. I won't fill you in on those details, but also the idea that writing could have that kind of payoff in terms of actual illness-related health center visits. That was a real surprise. It wasn't a surprise as much for the humanities community and the arts community. Folks have been using writing in various forms for centuries for their own wellness. But the new thing here was that here was a scientific study measuring those benefits that a lot of practitioners knew about for a long time. And so it caught the nation's attention, caught research community's attention. So that's what started this entire field. Then Pennebaker says, well, visits to the health center, that's one dependent measure that's valuable, but it's not great, right? There are a lot of reasons people might not have gone to the health center as much. Maybe the free writing is part of it. We're not sure what that complicated story is. So next, I'm on to chapter 2 now. Oh, I'm on the second study in chapter 2, I mean. Pennebaker teams up with a clinical psychologist and an immunologist, Kukul Glaser and Glaser, 2 years after the Pennebaker and Beal study. And they have a much more sophisticated experiment this time. This time they have 50 college students. They free wrote for 20 minutes a day rather than 15, but again for 4 consecutive days. Again, they had a control group, so about half of these folks would have been randomly assigned to just write about something superficial in their lives, like describe the clothes you have on, describe your favorite, hat or piece of jewelry. That those were typically the tasks. Trying to find something as benign as possible to serve as a neutral group. That's the control group. And then the experimental group, again, they learned from Pennebaker and Beale just to have them write about their thoughts and feelings. Not just thoughts, not just feelings, but that combined direction. So the experimental group wrote about thoughts and feelings about the most upsetting or traumatic experience in their lives. And since Pennebaker is working with an immunologist and another professional, he had access to, with the immunologist, better instrumentation. So what they did was they drew blood from the participants, the 50 college students, before and after the writing intervention, right? Before the 4 days and then after the 4 days. And then they assayed that blood to be able to look at the immunological response capabilities. What are they doing? They're basically measuring immune markers in the blood to see how robust the immunological response in the blood would be to an antibody, to a mitogen, right? To some sort of foreign object in the blood, namely an infection or other problem. Okay. So, what they found was that the folks in the experimental group, writing about thoughts and feelings about their upsetting episodes in their lives, they also immediately reported sadness and anxiety. They also, in that was in the near future, right after the study. But those folks also then, in the intervening time, after weeks after the study, reported a more value and meaning to the writing experiment. They also reported fewer health center visits for illness in the next 6 months. So far, they're just like the Pennebaker and Beale study. But what this study showed is they could, Pennebaker, Keikook, Glaser, and Glaser could show the clinical measure of immune system, right, by counting the immune markers like T lymphocytes. And they were able to show that the folks in the experimental group showed an improved immune function for the next 6 weeks. Okay? So that was an enormous finding. You now have free writing, in a diary with a pen, clinically shown to alter your immunological potency, your immunological response to mitogens. Okay, that was surprising for everyone, probably. I want to mention also in this, before I jump to the last bullet, I'll say there are more studies in this chapter, and in particular the career job loss study. So obviously read those, read the rest of the chapter well. I just wanted to give you a kind of method here for thinking through the studies, and I'd suggest using this same sort of outline, sample, protocol, control group, experimental group, and results, as I've done on the PowerPoint, to kind of think through other studies that you read in the text. Okay. The last thing I'll mention here, this chapter, I think it's very important for Pennebaker and Smythe and for the rest of the book. It's very important for them to emphasize for the reader that they don't believe that mere catharsis is responsible for these benefits. They believe that insight is the key ingredient. I just want to see if I have another. No, that'll be later in the semester. We'll get back to this notion of insight and catharsis. For now, I'll just say that, right, that they're thinking this is not explainable through a kind of neo-Freudian valuing of catharsis, and that it didn't account for these findings, and that they think it's because of the qualities of writing, or the phenomenon of writing about these experiences led the participants not just to vent or discuss the troubling episodes, but to gain insight from them, to make meaning from them, and in a sense, to begin to heal from them. And so that's a key point in this chapter. Okay, last, I'll just turn to an unstructured free writing exercise. This is one of the exercises offered in the book in the first 2 chapters, and I thought I would just include it here. And so we'll finish the PowerPoint today, and I'll ask you to try this writing exercise. So their directions for us simply, this is a kind of standard, what we call a Pennebaker protocol. Write whatever comes to mind for 10 to 20 minutes. So time it. Give yourself, set 10 minutes on your smartphone for an alarm and just set to the task of doing so. I would highly suggest being somewhere away from other people, away from distraction and disturbance. Set your phone on the non-distract, no notification mode, and try to write the entire time without stopping. I mean, that's really important. You'll see later in the semester as we continue to write. It's important to not stop and think about what you're going to write. The idea is to get into a kind of flow state where you're just writing whatever comes to mind. Okay? And so if you're using pen and paper, which is what I would suggest doing because it's a different experience to type it out. So if you're using pen and paper and you can't think what to write, just like scribble circles. Just scribble circles until the next word or idea comes out and then continue writing. Don't worry about style or grammar. I'll also say if they really say write whatever comes to mind, it's not only not worrying about style and grammar, it's also not worrying about society. This is a place, free writing is a place for a real kind of uninhibited honesty between you and the page. And that is an important part of later in the semester what we talk about as the letting go experience. So, yes, don't worry about style, don't worry about grammar, and don't worry about what society might think of what you're writing. Okay? The important thing is to keep writing continuously and just let yourself go. Now, a few important caveats here. One, I hope it's clear you certainly don't have to believe everything you write. The free writing is just a way to get in touch with your stream of consciousness in a way in which you're not censoring yourself, in a way in which you're not allowing those ego defense mechanisms to thwart what comes to mind. Okay, so try to just not evaluate what comes to mind for these 10 minutes. Write whatever comes to mind, and then, reread it and decide if anything that you wrote is worth thinking about. Um, and so in other words, my little phrase here is what I use is radical honesty means just writing whatever comes to you, right? Just being honest with your stream of consciousness. But that does not mean radical truth, right? It doesn't mean your consciousness is always speaking the truth. And so you might write things that seem cold or monstrous. You might write things that make you feel guilty. And I hope you can see that this is just your mind. You're just having an experiment here, getting in touch with that stream of consciousness, that inner monologue that's always going. And it's an experiment in not judging yourself, not evaluating that stream of consciousness, and just seeing what's there, and then later deciding if there were any valuable insights to be gained from that experience. Okay. Third, I'll say if any of these experiences with free writing cause you, unreasonable emotions, right, emotional pain, please stop them. Don't continue. Contact NU Counseling Services at this number that I've provided, to set up an appointment. Please, if it's something that's causing you stress and you're considering, maybe you shouldn't continue with the course, or you need a modified set of assignments for the course, just call me on my cell. If I don't answer, leave a message. Email me at jlittle@niagara.edu. Talk with me about this. We can figure something out. And of course, if this free writing sets, kind of triggers an emergency situation, please do call 911 or an emergency crisis center. But I'd suggest starting with 911 if there's an emergency. Over the years that I've taught this course, both in California and here at Niagara University, there are cases where students have not been able to finish the course because in the free writing, they, kind of excavated past pains that were too difficult to deal with. And this is an educational course. It's not a therapeutic setting. I'm not a professional to guide that kind of therapeutic journey. And so they said this course was maybe valuable because it showed them they have things to address in their past, but they had to drop the class or work with me to have a different set of assignments. And so that's been important. I want you to know that that's available to you. This course shouldn't be causing you any duress, right? This should be a course toward your well-being, not away from it. I've also had a lot of folks in their journals, in their essays afterwards, mention the value, the value in this experience, that it gave them time each day to really focus on themselves and address matters that they just haven't had time or the willingness to address. And so I hope you find it a very beneficial experience. And if you don't, reach out to counseling, me, or emergency services. That's really important. Okay, last. So I'd suggest this is the last slide of this presentation. I'd suggest just getting out your journal, getting out your pen, write this yellow writing prompt and the date at the top of the page, and set your phone for 10 or 20 minutes and give it a try. When you're done free writing and your phone goes off, what I would suggest is just draw a line across the page and then jot some notes down on what this experience was like for you. Okay? Not only maybe what you learned from the free writing today, but just what it was like to do this free write, because you'll be discussing what it was like in your final paper in the class, the reflective essay. Once again, I'll mention, as I did in past lectures, you will never be asked to share your actual free writing journal. That is private. You might even choose to free write and take some notes in a different journal on the free writes, and maybe shred or throw away, tear up and throw away the free write if it's something you don't want to keep, lying around. So the free writing journal, I'm never asked to collect, but you'll need a lot of notes on that experience because that's what you're writing about for the final paper. Okay, that's it for today. Please email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you tomorrow. Thanks.